She did not speak when she entered the room. She never needed to. Teresa de Mendonça e Almada, daughter of one of the oldest noble families of Portugal, had a silence that stirred men and unsettled women. In the ornate halls of Lisbon, filled with lace collars and measured gossip, she moved like a quiet storm, all composure on the surface, all knowing beneath it. No one thought she would marry a man beneath her station. Certainly not a man whose ambitions exceeded his pedigree, whose reputation was more ambition than legacy. But she did, and in doing so, she became the cornerstone of one of the most consequential and dangerous chapters in Portuguese history. Long before the city burned, before the earth split open in shrieks and devoured its churches and palaces, before the power of the Jesuits was extinguished and the nobles dragged into the light of justice or vengeance, there was just a marriage, a match, a decision made behind drawn curtains, sealed with a name and a dowry. Yet in that decision, a nation began to turn. Sebastião José de Carvalho y Melo was not a nobody, but in Lisbon's cruel social hierarchy, he might as well have been. He had noble blood, yes, but from a minor family. Worse, his temperament, too sharp, too calculating, earned him enemies faster than friends. He was clever and restless in a city that preferred inheritance over intellect. In salons, he was seen as the ambitious one, an oddity who studied British political theory when others collected poetry. Even those who tolerated him doubted he would ever rise far. Not until Teresa. She was not a political pawn, but she played politics well. The daughter of João de Mendonça Furtado, a seasoned noble with deep ties to the royal court, Teresa had seen how influence really worked. It wasn't shouted in parliaments or decreed by kings. It was whispered between marriages, traded over dinners, folded into dowries and sealed with children. She had no illusions about power, but she had ideas about who deserved it. Sebastião intrigued her, not just for his mind, but for his hunger. There was a fire in him, the kind that could either illuminate or destroy. Their courtship was not romantic in the sense poets loved. It was strategic, deliberate, and laced with tension. He brought ambition. She brought access. He brought vision. She brought legitimacy. And in a city like Lisbon, decaying at the edges, stagnant in thought, yet ripe with potential, that combination was dynamite. They married in 1733. The ceremony was modest by aristocratic standards, but Teresa ensured every member of the right families was present. Her message was clear. This man, this upstart with sharp eyes and no fortune, was now one of them. The murmurs began immediately, some doubtful, some mocking, and a few fearful. Sebastião had crossed the threshold, and he had done so not with wealth, but with a woman who believed in him more than anyone had before. The years that followed were formative. Teresa, often dismissed in historical footnotes, was in fact a masterful operator in courtly Lisbon. She knew which doors to open and which to bolt shut. She coached Sebastião on how to speak to power, how to endure the slights without reacting, how to weaponize his intelligence without alarming the old guard. She reshaped him, not into someone he wasn't, but into someone the city would eventually follow. When the opportunity came to send Sebastião abroad, it was Teresa who insisted he accept. The post of ambassador to London in 1738 was not glamorous. It was a test, a place to prove whether he could handle real diplomacy, real distance, real power. She accompanied him, not just as a wife, but as a strategist in lace and velvet. London, gray and stoic, did not welcome them. The English viewed Portuguese diplomats as relics, quaint, Catholic, backward. But Sebastião studied them obsessively. Their constitutional balance, their scientific academies, their Protestant pragmatism. And beside him, Teresa observed too. Not just the ideas, but the people behind them. The way women in London moved with more agency. The way political decisions were entangled with economic logic rather than divine right. She wrote letters back to Lisbon that were never published, filled with reflections on a world that seemed colder, but somehow more rational. She never complained about the cold, not aloud. But in her letters to her sister, she spoke of her fingers aching, of long days with little sunlight, of the isolation of being both noble and foreign. And yet she remained. Her death was sudden. In 1739, just a year after their arrival in London, she fell ill. Some said it was a respiratory fever. Others whispered of stress, homesickness, or something unnameable that festered in the air of foreign courts. Sebastião never confirmed the details. He only said she died in his arms, whispering something he never repeated. What is known is this: he returned to Lisbon a changed man, not defeated, sharper, not broken, hardened. Whatever softness Teresa had nurtured in him was buried with her. And yet, her influence remained like the scent of incense long after the altar has been cleared. He wore black for months, refused social engagements, and worked in near seclusion. But when he returned to public life, he was no longer the eager outsider. He had seen the machinery of modern states, had buried the woman who had taught him how to endure, and had tasted the bitter solitude that power demands. Lisbon would burn in 1755. That much was inevitable. But the fire started long before, not in the earth beneath the city, but in the mind of a man forged by grief and sharpened by a woman who, though gone, would haunt every stone he rebuilt. They called him the Marquês de Pombal. But before that, before the title, before the fear, before the reforms and the blood and the silence, there was Teresa. And it is through her eyes, not his, that this story truly begins. The fog in London was not like the morning mists of Lisbon. It was heavier, colder, and constant, a gray veil that clung to windows, gloves, and lungs. Teresa de Mendonça e Almada stood at the parlor window of their ambassadorial residence on Golden Square, watching it thicken like a living thing. She had arrived in England a noblewoman of Portugal, dressed in silks and centuries of tradition. But here, in this foreign capital that breathed reason and order like religion, she felt more like an artifact than a participant. Their arrival had gone unnoticed by most of London's elite. Britain in the 1730s was preoccupied with its own imperial matters, its Hanoverian dynasty, and the endless negotiation between crown and parliament. Foreign diplomats were necessary but irrelevant. Sebastião had come with little entourage, less money, and no real title to his name. His presence was tolerated, but rarely invited. Still, he watched. Teresa watched him watch. He devoured the minutes of Parliament, walked the streets as if he were taking measurements, lingered near coffee houses where men debated Locke and Newton as easily as others discussed weather and horses. The England he encountered was brisk and impersonal, but alive with systems. Everything followed a logic, a mechanism. Teresa understood what he saw in it: order, rationality, a counterpoint to the superstition and corruption that choked the Portuguese court back home. Yet what London gave Sebastião in ideas, it drained from Teresa in spirit. The salons were cold, the women colder. She missed the warmth of the Portuguese sun, yes, but more than that, she missed familiarity. She had always moved easily in Lisbon, a creature bred to its rituals. Here she felt observed, misread, occasionally exoticized but never embraced. Her titles meant little. Her knowledge of courtly maneuver meant less. The English wives were efficient, restrained, and measured their words like coin. Teresa could mirror them in dress and posture, but never in essence. She adjusted, of course. She always had. She wrote letters home, long ones, not just to her family, but to select confidants, noblewomen who still held court influence, reformist priests she trusted. In her correspondence, she chronicled not just daily life, but philosophical questions. Could a nation truly separate church from governance? Could Enlightenment principles flourish in a Catholic kingdom? Could Portugal, so bound to the past, truly change? Many of her letters were never saved. Some were likely destroyed, whether by time or by choice is unknown. But fragments survive in diplomatic archives and private family collections. They speak of a woman deeply engaged with the world, even as that world offered her little comfort. In one, she describes a dinner at the home of a British minister. They serve their roast beef with logic, she writes, and pass their wine like policy. It is all quite tasteless, but efficient. Sebastião, meanwhile, thrived in discomfort. The isolation fueled him. He met with British economists, read Adam Smith's early works, and became fascinated by how the state could shape behavior, not through fear, but through structure. Lisbon, in his mind, was a broken machine. Beautiful, yes, but rusted and erratic. Here in London, he saw the blueprint of something cleaner. Teresa challenged him when he spoke too much of England's superiority. It works for them, she would say, but would it work for us? What is modernity without memory? He rarely answered directly. He was already dreaming of systems and blueprints, of bureaucracies untouched by birthright. And yet, for all his theories, he relied on her utterly. She was still the one who translated the subtle signals at dinners, who coached him through letters to Lisbon's nobles, who kept his ambitions tethered to court realities. In early 1739, Teresa fell ill. It began with a cough. She dismissed it at first. English damp, she said, or a poorly ventilated study. But it lingered, grew worse. Doctors came and went with tonics and Latin. None helped. Her strength waned, but she remained composed. Even as her body failed her, her mind remained sharp. She wrote more letters, some of them sealed with wax and marked to be opened only in Lisbon. What they contained is still unknown. Sebastião was not by her side when she first collapsed. He was in conference with a Scottish economist, debating agricultural subsidies. A servant had to interrupt. When he arrived, she was conscious but pale, her voice faint. He dismissed the staff and closed the door. What passed between them in those final hours was never recorded, but witnesses claimed he did not leave the room for over a day, and when he emerged, his face was gray, not with grief, but with something colder. Determination, perhaps, or resolve calcified by pain. He arranged for her body to be prepared for transport back to Lisbon. There was no funeral in England. No eulogies, just a quiet departure from a city that had never welcomed her and never would. He returned to Lisbon with Teresa in a closed casket. No fanfare, no parade. Those who had doubted his place in court whispered again. He had lost his wife, they said, and with her, his only true anchor to power. They expected him to fade, but grief had transformed him, not softened, crystallized. In private, he mourned her, but in public, he became more precise, more patient, more dangerous. The lessons of England remained, but now they were fused with a personal silence that made him unreadable. He no longer sought alliances. He engineered them. He no longer lobbied. He calculated. Teresa had taught him how to speak to power. Now, with her gone, he spoke for it. He refused to remarry, at least for many years. When he eventually did, it was a formality. He never again formed a partnership of equals. Teresa had been the last person who challenged him as both man and minister. In the years that followed, Lisbon would fall into chaos. The earth would break, the palaces would burn, the churches would collapse, and Sebastião would rise. But he would never again speak her name in public, not out of shame, but reverence. As if to name her was to summon something too fragile for the brutal machinery he was about to build. The English called it fog, he called it clarity. And in that gray space between what was lost and what was possible, Sebastião José de Carvalho y Melo began his transformation from grieving husband to the man who would rule a kingdom from the rubble. Lisbon was warmer than he remembered. It was not just the sun, that brilliant Iberian heat that cracked tiles and deepened the scent of orange trees, but the pace, the mood, the way memory itself seemed to soften in the air. When Sebastião José de Carvalho y Melo stepped off the ship carrying the coffin of his late wife, Teresa de Mendonça y Almada, the city barely paused. A few diplomats paid respects. Some nobles nodded. Most simply observed. In a city governed by appearances and inheritance, grief was not currency. He arranged a burial befitting her name. She was laid to rest within the family chapel of the Almadas, as he requested, though some relatives resented the presence of a man they still called the minor noble. But no one challenged him openly. There was something different about him now, colder, measured. Teresa's death had not broken him. It had reshaped him. He returned to court life quietly. Others assumed he would drift back to obscurity, perhaps retire to his modest lands. But Sebastião had no intention of disappearing. In England, under Teresa's gaze, he had absorbed the blueprints of reform. Now without her, he would implement them, not as a theorist, but as an architect, a builder, a controller. But he did not rush. For years he remained a shadow. He accepted minor posts. He studied court politics, watched alliances shift like tides. He took careful measure of the king's moods, the minister's failures, the friction between nobles and clergy. What Teresa had taught him, how to be invisible until necessary, now became his armor. Then in 1750, King Juan I died. His son José I ascended the throne. Unlike his father, José was not a man of intellectual strength or political will. He loved music, hunting, and companionship more than governance. But he was not foolish. He knew the realm had grown stale. Corruption rotted the institutions. The church owned vast tracts of land and influence. The economy was dominated by foreign merchants and fractured monopolies. Portugal, once a titan of exploration, had become a soft echo of its former glory. The new king needed someone not tied to old families, someone modern, tireless, willing to offend the nobility if necessary. In short, someone dangerous. He summoned Sebastião. The appointment shocked the court. Sebastião José de Carvalho y Melo, widower, intellectual, reformist, was made Minister of Foreign Affairs, and soon after, Minister of the Kingdom. His rise was meteoric and absolute, and from the moment he assumed power, he began reshaping the country. One law, one institution, one enemy at a time. But he never did it alone. Not truly. Though Teresa was gone, her presence lingered in the architecture of his rule. In every policy he drafted, there were echoes of their late-night conversations in London. In every law aimed at weakening privilege, there was the memory of her warning him never to become a servant of the old class. She had believed in structure, not just in society, but in the self. Discipline, precision, restraint. She had once told him, in a rare moment of vulnerability, that her greatest fear was not death, but waste. The waste of potential, of time, of nations. He carried that sentence like a commandment. His first reforms were subtle. He reorganized the administrative council. He restructured tax farming systems to reduce noble skimming. He limited the ability of foreign agents to buy influence in Portuguese ports. These were dry policies, unnoticed by the people, but they shifted the balance of power ever so slightly toward the crown and toward him. Then came the schools. Under Teresa's influence, Sebastião had always believed that ignorance was the true chain of the people. The Jesuits controlled most of the nation's education, rigid, dogmatic, resistant to anything remotely progressive. He began laying the groundwork for a secular educational system, one grounded in Enlightenment principles, science, mathematics, political economy. In his mind, Portugal would either join the modern world or be devoured by it. But his ambitions stirred enemies. The nobility whispered of his arrogance. The clergy condemned his secular leanings. Even within the royal court, old ministers cautioned that he was moving too quickly, too boldly. He did not listen. At night he worked in silence. He had no heir to distract him, no love to anchor him. He dined alone, often rereading notes Teresa had once written in the margins of a diplomatic treatise. He kept one of her brooches in a drawer, unopened but always near. When sleep eluded him, which it often did, he walked the halls of the ministry, lit only by lanterns, murmuring to himself the outlines of reforms not yet written. In the public eye, he became a figure of awe and fear. The people called him O Sebastião do Rei, the King Sebastião. His presence in the streets was rare, but when it happened, silence followed. He was not charismatic. He was efficient. And that, in a city ruled for centuries by theatrics, was more terrifying than any sword. One story, perhaps apocryphal, tells of a woman who tried to bribe a clerk in a government office. The clerk refused. When asked why, he is said to have whispered, "Because he watches." The "he" was never clarified. It didn't need to be. But even as he rose, he kept her name close. On the anniversary of Teresa's death, he withdrew from court duties, citing vague illness. No servants were allowed into his study. What he did in those hours remains unknown. Some say he prayed. Others believe he wrote letters to her that were never sent, never sealed. Perhaps both are true. Her memory was more than sentiment. It was strategy. Every time he faced a critical decision, especially one involving blood, he asked himself, or claimed to, what she would have done. He did not always follow the answer, but he asked. As his influence grew, so did the tensions with the church. The Jesuits, sensing a threat, began to mobilize. They published pamphlets, influenced nobles, whispered accusations. They portrayed him as an agent of foreign ideologies, a destroyer of tradition, a man who sought to replace God with reason. He did not respond publicly. Instead, he prepared. The confrontation would come. But first, he had to do the unthinkable, reshape a city. On the morning of November the 1st, 1755, Lisbon would collapse. The earthquake would bring the capital to its knees. Thousands would die. Churches would crumble. Palaces would burn. And in the smoldering aftermath, Sebastião would rise not just as minister, but as something closer to a sovereign. But that story belongs to fire and stone. For now, in the shadows of quiet halls and papered windows, the widow's legacy lived on. Not in mourning, but in motion, in the steady, unrelenting pace of reform, in the silent conviction of a man who had loved once, lost once, and vowed never again to waste a moment. He did not build statues of her. He built institutions. He did not speak her name. He spoke her principles. And for a time, and perhaps the last in the kingdom's long history, the shape of Portugal was drawn not by swords or saints, but by a widow's memory and a husband's will. The morning of November the 1st, 1755, began like a psalm. It was the Feast of All Saints, a holy day when candles flickered in every chapel, when incense rose like breath through the cathedrals of Lisbon. The faithful gathered early, dressed in their finest, lips murmuring hymns while the marble floor echoed under heels. The sky was clear, the air oddly still, and bells rang from the towers in rhythm with the heartbeat of the city. No one suspected that the same earth beneath their prayers was already moving, already cracking. At 9:40 a.m., the ground convulsed. It began with a low, guttural groan, a tremor, then a violent shudder. Stones shattered, altars crumbled. The great churches of Lisbon, São Vicente, Santa Catarina, the Carmo convent, were among the first to fall. Chandeliers crashed from ceilings. Candles overturned and sparked flames upon lace and wood. Walls split open like mouths screaming in silence. The Tagus River, serene only minutes before, surged backward, then forward again in a monstrous wave. A tsunami, almost biblical, rushed inland, swallowing ships, piers, and anyone who had fled to the harbor for safety. Lisbon was dying, not slowly, not metaphorically, in fire, flood, and stone. Sebastião José de Carvalho y Melo was not at Mass that morning. He had long since stopped attending ceremonies. Whether from spiritual disillusionment or political calculation, he had removed himself from the rhythms of public piety. He was in his study, a habit he never abandoned, reviewing a report on grain shortages when the floor beneath him lurched. Shelves toppled. Plaster rained. Outside, he heard not screams, but a strange collective roar, as if the city itself were gasping. He emerged into a city unrecognizable. The royal palace was gone. Entire quarters were flattened. Fires raged with no water to quell them. The king, José Fern, had fled to the countryside in panic, setting up a makeshift camp in a royal park. The archbishop was missing. Dozens of government officials were either dead or presumed so. Nobles wandered in blood-streaked finery, their wigs askew, their titles meaningless beneath the ash. In the vacuum of collapse, Sebastião acted. He did not cry. He did not pray. He commanded. Bury the dead, feed the living, rebuild the city. His orders were clear, immediate, and terrifying in their precision. He formed emergency brigades to remove corpses and prevent disease. Food supplies were redirected from surrounding provinces. Looters were hanged, publicly, swiftly. Rumors circulated that some of the hanged had not been thieves, but nobles who had questioned his authority. It hardly mattered. The message was unmistakable. The old world had died with the churches. A new order was being born, one ruled by logic, not lineage. The earthquake had destroyed over 80% of Lisbon. But Sebastião did not see a disaster. He saw a blank page. Within days, he summoned engineers, architects, and cartographers. He ordered a full urban redesign of the capital: wider streets, earthquake-resistant buildings, systematic drainage. No rebuilding would be permitted without official approval. The old medieval maze of alleys and slopes was gone. In its place would rise a city of straight lines, rational proportions, and symmetry. The Baixa Pombalina, as it would come to be known, was not just urban planning, it was philosophy in stone. This was not a resurrection of the past, it was a repudiation of it. In private, he kept a journal. Few entries survive, but one, written weeks after the quake, reads, "We must not rebuild what fell. It fell because it was weak. God did not do this. Time did." In that sentence lay his worldview and his rupture from the soul of his country. Portugal was a deeply Catholic nation. For centuries, it had interpreted calamity as punishment or providence. Priests cried from the rubble that this was divine wrath for sin. Monks preached repentance. Some processions resumed amid the ash, carrying icons through streets of charred bodies. But Sebastião silenced them. Public mourning, yes. Public hysteria, no. The state, not the church, would lead this resurrection. He ordered the Inquisition to cease its public burnings for the year. It was not mercy, it was optics. He could not have flames of faith competing with the flames of reconstruction. For the first time, the machinery of secular government moved faster, more decisively, and with more legitimacy than that of the cross. And in every decision, in every policy, the ghost of Teresa lingered. He remembered their walks through London, her fascination with order and sanitation, her letters praising British urban design, her warnings against rebuilding systems that were already rotten. She had once told him, during a winter storm, "A nation cannot love its ruins more than its children." He quoted that line in a private letter to the king. It became the motto of his rebuilding plan, though no one ever knew the source. Still, not all welcomed his vision. The nobility fumed. Their estates had been leveled, their privileges suddenly worthless. The Jesuits watched warily. The common people grumbled that the new housing was plain, uniform, devoid of the flourishes that once adorned Lisbon's skyline. But Sebastião did not flinch. He had no interest in sentiment. He was building a machine, efficient, durable, uncorrupted by nostalgia. In public ceremonies, he stood next to architects, not bishops. He praised masonry and mathematics more than miracles. His speeches, rare but potent, invoked progress, not providence. And though the king still technically reigned, all eyes turned to the man who had stayed when others fled. The man who had not knelt before rubble, but measured it. For this he was made Count of Arras in 1759, then Marquês de Pombal a decade later. The titles mattered less than the symbolism. He had become Portugal's spine. But in the quiet hours, when the city slept and the scaffolding creaked in the wind, he sometimes walked the edges of the Baixa, a solitary figure in black, hands clasped behind his back. No guards, no entourage. He passed by the rebuilt churches, fewer now, less ornate, and stared at the facades, not in admiration, in assessment. He would sometimes stop before one particular square where Teresa had once sketched buildings from memory. No one knew why he paused there. No one ever dared ask. The Lisbon he built was not the Lisbon she had known, but it was hers in a strange way. Her vision, her discipline, her refusal to romanticize the past. He had rebuilt her ghost into its foundations, and beneath it all, under the white stone, the broad avenues, the new facades, the bodies still lay, thousands of them, priests and prostitutes, merchants and monks, infants and invalids. The earth had not spared them, and the city did not dig them up. Lisbon, the new Lisbon, was built on their silence. As he returned each night to his residence, Sebastian would remove his gloves slowly, place them on her old escritoire, and sit. He did not pray, he rarely wrote. He simply sat, the ruler of a city born of fire and blueprints, haunted not by guilt but by memory. They called it progress. He called it justice. But in the ashes of All Saints' Day, what truly rose was something stranger, a Lisbon that had no saints left, only survivors. They said that the only thing left standing after the earthquake was the church. But Sebastião José de Carvalho and Melo knew better. The steeples may have survived, but the spell had broken. The people who once whispered prayers in the dark now looked to a different altar, one made of stone, plan, and policy. In the crucible of ruin, something irreversible had occurred. Portugal had begun to shift its center of gravity from faith to function. And behind that shift stood one man. In the years following the catastrophe, the Marquês de Pombal became more than a minister. He became the axis around which the realm spun. The King José III withdrew deeper into his private world of music and hunting, content to sign what Sebastião placed before him. Nobles sulked in half-rebuilt mansions. Merchants watched nervously as regulations replaced their backroom deals. But it was the church, more specifically, the Jesuits, who began to see in him not just a rival, but a heretic with a pen. The Society of Jesus had long held the soul of Portugal. They educated its nobles, advised its monarchs, and governed its colonies with spiritual authority cloaked in intellectual rigor. To challenge them was not just administrative, it was existential. And Sebastião, once careful, now moved openly. His reforms had already begun to pry away their influence. New state schools without clerical oversight, trade policies that favored secular merchants, and the slow, steady draining of Jesuit control in Brazil and Goa. But he wanted more. Not containment, not compromise. Elimination. In 1757, 2 years after the earthquake, he issued a decree that prohibited the Jesuits from teaching secular subjects. Then another, revoking their tax exemptions and overseas possessions. Then another, expelling them from certain court appointments. Each order was surgical, cloaked in bureaucratic language, but the intention was unmistakable. He was not just neutralizing them, he was erasing them, and yet he never claimed to be anti-religious. In fact, he often quoted scripture when justifying his policies. "Render unto Caesar," he once said in council, "what is Caesar's? Render unto reason what is reason's." He understood power and how symbols mattered. So long as the church remained in name, he could gut its machinery in practice. Behind closed doors, his ministers whispered of a looming confrontation. But Sebastião was calm, coldly so. He had weathered fire, flood, and death. The wrinkled threats of robed men did not move him. What did move him, what had always moved him, was efficiency. He began compiling evidence. Testimonies of abuse in Jesuit missions, records of financial impropriety, letters hinting at political interference. Some of the accusations were legitimate, others as less so. But truth in his hands was a tool, not a doctrine. Then in 1758, fate handed him a weapon. One autumn night, the king's carriage was ambushed outside Lisbon. Shots were fired. The king survived, barely. Panic seized the court. Ministers scrambled. Guards arrested suspects. And through the chaos, Sebastião stepped forward with quiet finality. The would-be regicide, he declared, had been orchestrated by the noble house of Tavora, one of the most ancient and powerful families in the kingdom. But more than that, he added with a measured voice, the Tavoras had been aided, perhaps even guided, by members of the Jesuit order. The accusation landed like a thunderclap. Arrests followed, torture, confessions, coerced or genuine, trials that were less about evidence than performance. Sebastião presided not as judge but as architect. He designed every stage of the spectacle. The Tavoras were tried, condemned, and in January 1759, executed publicly in a display so brutal that Lisbon held its breath. Heads rolled. Titles vanished. Estates were seized. But it was the Jesuits who felt the blade most sharply. Weeks after the executions, Sebastião issued the decree. All members of the Society of Jesus were to be expelled from Portugal and its colonies. Their schools shuttered, their lands confiscated, their ships boarded under armed escort and sent out to sea. Not since the Reformation had a Catholic country so violently severed ties with its own spiritual elite. The Pope protested. France and Spain expressed concern, but the people, exhausted, frightened, confused, watched in silence. Many felt relief. The old order had proven powerless in the face of disaster. Sebastião had rebuilt the city, punished the guilty, and now it seemed, cleansed the rot. In his office, he lit no candles to mark the purge. He recorded no celebratory words. Instead, he opened a small drawer. Inside was a letter, aged, folded, bearing the handwriting of a woman long buried. Teresa had once written of her unease around certain priests, how power cloaked in holiness made her shiver. He read the letter again that night, then placed it back gently. He never built a monument to the fallen Jesuits. He built a university. The University of Coimbra, long a Jesuit stronghold, was restructured, secularized, and filled with modern curricula. Mathematics, chemistry, natural philosophy. Professors were vetted not for piety, but for competence. The next generation of Portuguese elites would be trained not to pray for answers, but to calculate them. Still, not all accepted the transformation. Rumors grew that Sebastião used witchcraft, that he met with foreign agents, that he ruled the king like a puppet. His enemies painted him as a tyrant in Enlightenment's clothing, a cold bureaucrat with bloodied hands. He did not respond. Power, he believed, did not explain itself. It demonstrated. But alone, in the quiet hours, there were moments. Moments when his hand hovered over the drawer that held her letters. Moments when the wind through the windows sounded like the sea in London. Moments when he walked the new avenues of Lisbon, straight, measured, unyielding, and wondered if she would have recognized what he had built. Once, in the reconstructed palace library, he paused before a painting that had been salvaged from the rubble. It depicted a crucifixion, the old agonized Christ, eyes turned skyward. He stared at it for a long time, then turned away. He had not replaced God. But he had challenged him, or at least the men who spoke in his name, and in doing so, he had recast a kingdom, crown and crucifix, one ornamental, the other weaponized. And standing between them, not as priest or prince, but as minister and widower, was a man no longer just enforcing order, but writing history with a steel-tipped quill and an unshakable silence. By the year 1760, the corridors of power in Lisbon had changed their language. No longer whispered in Latin prayers or sung in courtly ballads, power now moved in the hush of memoranda, the shuffle of military boots, and the dry rasp of decrees read aloud without flourish. The Jesuits were gone, their schools emptied, their wealth absorbed. The nobility, bruised and bewildered, kept their titles but not their influence. Ministers spoke less of divine will and more of logistics, tariffs, taxes. And at the heart of it all, Sebastião José de Carvalho and Melo, the Marquês de Pombal, watched everything with the detachment of an engineer observing pressure gauges. But pressure builds, even in the most elegant of systems. Beneath the surface of this rational new Portugal, something dangerous stirred. Families once at the summit of aristocratic life, Tavora, Aveiro, Alorna, had been humiliated or destroyed. The court, stripped of its sacred rituals and familiar hierarchies, had become a place of performance without script. People smiled with their mouths but not their eyes. Whispers filled the back rooms again. Some of them spoke of vengeance. The attempt on King José I's life in 1758 had provided Pombal the justification he needed to remake the nation. But not everyone accepted the official version. The plot, according to his findings, had been masterminded by the Tavora family, with spiritual guidance and logistical support from the Jesuits. The evidence was damning, or convenient, or both. The executions that followed, brutal, public, and calculated, had sent a message. Yet that message, carved into noble flesh and displayed in the open square, was not forgotten. It festered. Some saw the Tavora case not as justice, but as theater, a massacre designed to consolidate power under one man, a cold, brilliant man, a man without royal blood, without a clerical robe, without a family name strong enough to excuse the reach of his hand. And so the court bled quietly. There was no uprising. That would have been suicide. But resistance took other forms. Delays in paperwork, backroom alliances, anonymous pamphlets accusing Pombal of tyranny, impiety, betrayal. He read them all. He kept some, burned others. None of it surprised him. Teresa had once warned him that after revolution comes isolation. You will find yourself alone. Not because they defeat you, she had written, but because you no longer fear them. And that is the deepest insult of all. Still, it was not pamphlets or rumors that shook him. It was something far more personal. In 1762, amidst whispers of new threats and hidden enemies, a sealed letter arrived in his private study. It had no seal, no signature. Inside, written in a careful, feminine hand, was a single sentence. He kills not for Portugal, but for his own ghost. He read it once, then again. He did not speak of it to anyone. But that night, he opened the locked drawer where Teresa's letters rested. For the first time in years, he reread the first note she had written to him in London. The one where she had described him not as a politician, but as a man born to hold a blade with the gentleness of a surgeon and the certainty of a butcher. He had laughed at the line then. Now he did not. That same year, in an ironic twist history often indulges, another blood crisis surfaced, not in whispers, but in flesh. A distant relative of Teresa, Count Paulo de Almada, was implicated in a corruption scandal involving military contracts. The evidence presented by Pombal's inspectors was overwhelming. Forged documents, laundered payments, kickbacks to foreign agents. The Count pleaded innocence, claimed political targeting, claimed blood ties to the late Teresa. It reached Pombal's desk with a recommendation for leniency, for family, for her name. He crossed out the note with a single line, wrote in the margin, "Justice is not kin." The Count was arrested, tried, convicted, stripped of his lands. Privately, in a letter never sent, Pombal wrote, "Let them learn that even she would not have stood in my way. Her name is not a shield for cowardice." But the blow struck somewhere deeper than policy. Teresa's family, once the ladder by which he had climbed the edifice of power, was now reduced to whispers and footnotes. And the man who had once stood beside her at embassies and salons now stood alone atop the wreckage of an old order. Alone, but undefeated. In 1769, 10 years after the Tavora affair, the king elevated him further. He became the Marquês de Pombal. The title, long delayed, long disputed, was now undeniable. He had rebuilt Lisbon, vanquished the Jesuits, rewritten the role of minister itself. Portugal was his to mold. And yet something began to shift. The king, older now, grew more withdrawn. He suffered from panic attacks, especially at night, and refused to stay within stone walls. A trauma from the earthquake he never truly escaped. His health declined, and with it, his ability to shield Pombal from the court's growing resentment. Nobles began to return to favor. The church, though humbled, found new language for its sermons. Young courtiers, raised in the shadow of Pombal's reforms, began to question their rigidity. Was this truly enlightenment, or a different kind of absolutism? Pombal knew what they said. He had spies, clerks, informants, but he did not fear being toppled. What he feared was entropy, the slow unmaking of structure, the return of soft power, of compromise, of memory. At a private council, when asked whether recent leniencies might be wise to soothe tensions, he replied without expression, "Compromise is the currency of those with something left to lose. I lost her. I lost peace. What more do they think they can take?" And yet they did not need to take. They only had to wait. Blood in the court did not flow like it had in the Tavora affair. It dripped, invisible, internal, eating away at loyalties, at structures, at certainty. It was not dramatic. It was worse. It was quiet. And when the king died, as all kings do, it would be the final blow. But not yet, not today. Today, the Marquês still ruled, still signed, still built. But even he, for all his silence and steel, could feel it. The air was changing again. And this time, there would be no earthquake to burn the past, only the slow return of everything he had once torn down. The old king died in his sleep, not with a cry or a sigh, but with the soft, final hush of breath slipping from a body that had long been ruled by fear. José Firminer of Portugal had once been a monarch, then a shadow, then finally a man haunted by stone. Since the earthquake of 1755, he had refused to live within walls. For over 2 decades, his court had wandered among wooden pavilions and tented palaces, avoiding the weight of ceilings and the memory of falling. And while he wandered, Sebastião José de Carvalho y Melo, the Marquês de Pombal, ruled. But with the king's death in February of 1777, that rule met its reckoning. Her name was Maria Francisca Isabel Josefa Antonia Gertrudis Rita Joanna, but history would remember her simply as Queen Maria the One, his daughter, his opposite, his punishment. Where her father had feared, she resented. Where he had abdicated power, she seized it. And where he had allowed a minister to act in his name, she intended to act for herself. From the moment she took the throne, it was clear. Maria would not be ruled by the ghost of Pombal's reforms, nor the man himself. She had grown up under his shadow, a childhood of silenced priests, banished Jesuits, executed nobles, in a city rebuilt not with reverence, but with math. To her, Pombal was not the savior of Lisbon. He was the tyrant of Portugal, and she hated him. The court, sensing the shift, turned like wolves catching scent. The same nobles who had kept their heads down for 2 decades now raised them again, blinking into the light. Old names returned to conversations. Portraits once removed were rehung. The word mercy appeared again in palace vocabulary. Pombal did not plead. He did not retire. He waited. The queen, careful but certain, began the unmaking. First came the formal dismissal. On March 5, 1777, less than a month after her ascension, she relieved him of all political duties. There was no ceremony, no condemnation, just a signature and silence. After 27 years at the helm of the state, the man who had reshaped Portugal was out. He was 77 years old. Then came the accusations. Pamphlets flooded Lisbon, tales of corruption, abuse, torture under his watch. Many were exaggerated, some were lies, but enough was true. The Tavora affair, the exile of the Jesuits, the seizures of property, the iron grip on policy, all became weapons. A formal inquiry began. It was not a trial, not technically, but it might as well have been. He was ordered to remain in Pombal, the rural estate from which his title derived. He was watched, questioned, stripped not of wealth, but of legacy. The queen never spoke his name in public. It was as if he had become an embarrassment, a wound to be concealed under silk and incense. But her ministers pursued every thread of his past. They tried to reopen closed cases, to quantify cruelty, to explain how a minister had become a monarch in all but name. But the deeper they searched, the more complicated the truth became. Because the Portugal he had ruled, though brutal in method, had also flourished in fact. Lisbon was modern. Schools were open. Roads connected cities. Trade had increased. Enlightenment thought had a foothold. His enemies hated him, but they walked his streets, sat in his classrooms, and benefited from the very institutions he had forced into being. He had ruled with a surgeon's calm and a hangman's hand. That contradiction made him difficult to erase. Still, the queen pressed on. His name was removed from public buildings. Decrees issued during his tenure were reviewed, rewritten, or repealed. Historians were instructed to revise court records. His portrait, once displayed near the king's desk, was removed, rumored to be burned. He received it all in silence. In his estate, far from the halls he had once dominated, Pombal returned to routine. He awoke early, took long walks, read by candlelight. He refused to write memoirs. When asked for a defense, he answered only, "The city stands." One letter survives from this period, written to a foreign ambassador who had once dined with him in London. It reads, "My hands are clean of regret, but not of consequence. If they now wish to undo what I did, let them try. But undoing is not the same as building. and Lisbon remembers which stones were laid by reason and which by prayer. He outlived many of his enemies, but not Maria. In 1782, he died quietly in Pombal. No bells rang, no state mourning was declared. He was buried not in grandeur, but in modesty. A small service, a few loyal attendants, no royal presence. And yet, as the city he had rebuilt continued to grow, as the roads he had paved carried goods, as the schools he had founded taught new generations, as the earthquake's scars faded beneath symmetrical architecture, his absence became presence. He had ruled a nation through fire and silence. He had broken the Jesuits with pen and law. He had executed nobles, reformed commerce, centralized power. He had rebuilt a capital not to remember the past, but to defy it. And the queen who hated him, though she stripped his name, could not unbuild what he had laid brick by brick. That was the paradox. In punishing him, she confirmed him. In erasing him, she immortalized him. And in the end, Portugal walked upon his legacy, whether it acknowledged him or not. Lisbon never truly slept. Even in the quietest hours, long after the last tram had shuddered up the Alfama hills, long after the last prayer had faded beneath stone vaults, the city murmured. Water lapped at the edges of the Tagus like memory trying to reach the shore, and the streets whispered with footsteps no longer present. In the Praça do Comércio, where sunlight once filtered through smoke and ruin, pigeons now pecked at crumbs dropped by tourists, unaware that the stone beneath their feet had once been soaked in ash, and before that, blood. And towering above it all, a bronze figure rode calmly toward the heart of the city. The monument to the Marquês de Pombal stands today in the heart of Lisbon. A man in formal dress, facing forward, hand upon a lion, gaze locked toward the Baixa district he once rebuilt from rubble. It is regal, silent, resolute. But the man who once walked those streets was never so still. He had been many things: diplomat, reformer, widower, executioner, architect of modern Portugal. But to the city he left behind, he became something stranger, a paradox cast in bronze. And it is in that paradox that Teresa de Mendonça, a Almada, long gone, long forgotten by the public, finds her place again. She has no statue, no plaque, no square bearing her name. But it was she who introduced him to court life, she who taught him the codes of noble survival, she who, in London, steadied his rage and honed his ambition, she who warned him, quietly and without drama, that reform without restraint becomes tyranny with a new uniform. He did not always listen, but he never forgot. In his final days after his fall from power, when the Queen had erased his name from official memory and the state he built had begun to erode beneath political compromise, he did not lament. He walked the grounds of his estate in Pombal with steady steps, pausing to observe the vineyards, the chimneys, the slow rhythm of ordinary life, a rhythm he had never known while governing. He spoke little. When visitors came, diplomats, former allies, curious young reformers, he answered with brevity. Some asked about the earthquake, the Jesuits, the Tavoris. He responded only once with reflection. The earth trembled, he said, but people were already crumbling. I simply finished what time had begun. He never remarried, never fathered children. He left no heirs in blood, only in design. Ministers copied his systems. Cities mimicked his structure. His laws, though revised, remained the skeleton of modern Portuguese governance. And yet what haunted him most were not laws, but letters. After his death in 1782, a servant discovered a sealed wooden box beneath the floorboards of his study. Inside were over 24 letters, written by Teresa, written to Teresa, never sent, never shared. In them he speaks not as minister, but as man. He confesses doubts, documents moments of horror, and asks questions no sovereign would dare voice aloud. One letter reads, "You warned me that I might one day build a nation and lose myself in the scaffolding. I have built it, yes, but I do not know if I remain inside." Another, "They will burn my name, perhaps rightly, but they will not burn the stone, and in that stone your silence still breathes." These letters were never published. They remain tucked away in a private archive, shown only to a few historians who know the weight of memory. But their existence whispers the truth, that the man known to history as the Marquês de Pombal had always carried her, not on his sleeve, but in the hollows of his decisions. He was feared, admired, loathed, misunderstood. But in his own heart, shaped before titles and beyond them, he was still the man who had once watched a woman read by candlelight in London, her brow furrowed over foreign policy, her fingers smudged with ink. He had loved her in the only way he could, fiercely, silently, without embellishment. And perhaps that is why he built so ruthlessly, because love, once lost, demanded no less than a city to hold its echo. Today, tourists gather at his monument and snap photos, unaware of the woman who made that man possible. They see a lion, a coat of arms, a name etched in metal. They do not see the widow. They do not see the sacrifice. They do not see the hands that shaped his, then vanished. But Lisbon remembers. Lisbon, rebuilt in lines and logic, remembers the fire, remembers the silence that followed, remembers the widow who walked beside the man before he was marble, before he was feared, before he was king in all but name. It ends not with a coronation, nor with an execution, but with a contradiction. He ruled without bloodline, loved without witness, lost everything, and yet left everything behind. A man who feared chaos but became its master. A city born in flame but rebuilt without faith. And a woman whose name history nearly erased, but whose influence still echoes in every stone that does not fall.